MoMA. I'm Jess Van Ostrand. I work in the education department here at the museum. I'd like to welcome you to our 1:30 gallery session here in the Jackson Pollock exhibition. The gallery session program is something we run twice a day, every day that the museum is open at 11:30 and 1:30. And every once in a while we will feature a special guest who has a direct connection to the work in some way. We're very pleased today to welcome MoMA's chief conservator, Jim Coddington, who'll be here to talk about his work specific to Pollock and to take your questions. And we're also joined by MoMA educator Raffaele Berarita, who is a very experienced educator here at the museum and works specifically with Pollock on a frequent basis. So with that in mind, we will have a conversation for a little while. We'll open up to questions. We'd love to hear from all of you. We're glad to see such a big crowd. So thank you for being here, and welcome, Jim and Raffaele. We'll have a seat here. Thank you. Right, that's true. Hi, so I thought I would just start things with a general question. How many of you here are familiar with the work of conservation? Some half-hearted hands have gone up. So maybe we should start with a general question. Jim, would you tell us what a conservator does, what your job is?
Thanks, Jess. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone out there streaming in the world, however many of you there are. So what a conservator does is fundamentally we restore works of art. There are many different specialties within the field of conservation. I am trained as a paintings conservator. That may be why I drew the assignment to work on the Jackson Pollock. It might also have to do with the fact that I worked on the Jackson Pollock exhibition in 1998, back kind of mid-career for me here at MoMA. But when you work in a museum as a conservator, there are other responsibilities besides that hands-on restoration and conservation. There are preservation activities, and that really takes up the biggest part of our time. That encompasses things like what is the proper storage for works, what is the proper handling for them, how can we ship them and receive them for exhibitions if something from our collection is going out on loan or something from another lender is coming in on loan. These are all responsibilities that we have a part in making sure that works that are here, whether in our collection or from another collection, come here, are visible to you all, accessible to you all, and always in a safe way.
I've heard conservation described as the scientific branch of a museum. Would you agree with that? What's your take on this description of it being? Are you a scientist, Jim?
I am not a scientist, and I would say it's only a partial characterization of what a conservator does and what a conservator should do. It's a necessary part of what we do, but in the end, when you are working on a work of art, when you are caring for a work of art, it is not a scientific process. Science is a tool that we use to understand what the materials are, how those materials will age, what the materials are that we use when we are restoring work, how those will age. That is what you would call the scientific part of it. But you are still putting your hands on a work of art that has changed over time, that you are responsible for making look a certain way, and that is an interpretive exercise. We try to keep that to a minimum, and that is why the science comes into this. You want to, it's not anything goes. You have to do a lot of background research to understand what the work once looked like and what you are trying to make it look like with your restoration. So, again, just to underline, science is a tool for us. It is not the end for us. It's just a means.
So can you give us an example of maybe something really difficult in your work, or what a big challenge might be in the work that you do? It sounds like very particular work where possibly a lot is at stake. I just would love to know a little bit about what makes it difficult. What are the big challenges?
Well, just about anything presents a challenge in some degree. One of the particular challenges of working in a museum that is dedicated to collecting and displaying modern and contemporary art is that artists will use just about anything that is available to them. I'm fond of saying that if the material has been invented, then an artist has used it, and it's going to come into our collection the next day. So what we are challenged with in this museum and other museums like this that collect in this area is that the materials we may not have seen before. Now, I've seen thousands and thousands of oil paintings. I'm pretty familiar with that as material. I've not necessarily seen a mix of Elmer's glue and some other material added to it, joined in peculiar ways with unusual carpentry involved. There could be any number of things. Artists are, just fantastically inventive, and it's our responsibility to figure out ways that respect what their invention is, what their goals are with that work, and understand the materials that they use to achieve that. So it's the variety and really vast expanse of different kinds of materials that are a challenge for us.
And since we're here to talk about Jackson Pollock specifically, can you just give us an introduction to your history working with his work and what makes it so interesting, or what's unique about working with Pollock?
Well, that's a nice segue, because I was just talking about the inventive materials that artists use, and certainly when Jackson Pollock was first painting in his classic drip technique that we see in this room here in particular, he was taken to task for that he was using experimental materials that will never last. I think we can be pretty satisfied that these paintings have lasted well. They lasted because those materials were more stable than people thought at the time, but also because museums and collectors and conservators like myself and others have been caring for them and making sure that they don't deteriorate over time, or deteriorate at what we would regard as an acceptable rate. They are still available for viewing.
So tell us. Well, I would love to hear about your first. Like, what's your first encounter with his work?
It really began when I came to the museum here, and that was a long time ago. But it really intensified at the time of the 1998 retrospective that we held here at the museum. It was curated by Kurt Barnado and Pepe Carmel, and that was just an unbelievably great exhibition. It brought together really just about all of the great masterworks that Pollock created in all his various media. He was not just a painter. He worked very productively and very creatively in lots of different media. I would encourage you all to look at the prints in this exhibition. They are achieved with really extraordinary skill and endless inventiveness, just as his paintings are. So that exhibition gave me a lot of very close exposure to Pollock. And for conservators, let me just make a little detour here. Exhibitions like that, retrospective exhibitions where you have a lot of paintings or other works that come in and literally sit side by side, so you can go from one to the other. That visual comparison to know what a work looks, what the other works say around 1950 painted by Pollock, gives you a kind of touchstone, a way of understanding how they have aged over time, how some have maybe aged a little bit differently. But if you do ultimately take on a restoration of Pollock, you now have some very direct information about what others from that period look like. And so the restorations that we undertook several years ago, and it was a project where we worked on 3 different Pollock in our collection. The thinking about that began in 1998, but it took us all that time to find the opportunity in our schedule, in the exhibition schedule of the works, and to do the additional research that we needed to be confident to go forward with the 3 restorations that we ultimately did do.
Well, I'd like to pass my mic to Raffaellino, who I know has a lot of questions for you.
Yeah, I would say, because here we have 2 major work by Pollock, but done with the different materials, if you want to share the differences and the specificities.
Can I go?
Of course.
Thank you. That could be a little bit of a challenge for you all. I'll start with talking about this painting here, 1A, 1948. And painted in a somewhat typical Pollock drip style, but there are a few things that make this a little bit more of a transitional piece between his work where he's working directly on a canvas and where he's actually staying above the canvas and dripping and pouring, this sort of classic picture we have of Pollock that you see illustrated at the opening of the exhibition here, of him in his studio, flinging paint on the canvas, dripping and pouring the paint. So he starts with a raw canvas here, just a basic canvas. In this case, he does not treat it with anything. He doesn't put down a sizing or any other sort of sealing layer on the canvas. Sometimes he did that. In this case, he did not do that. And the first marks that he makes on the canvas, and you know, I'm just telling you this from my own visual observation. I'm not using any special technical imaging or x-rays, anything like that. This is just by spending a lot of time looking closely and following the different marks that an artist makes on a canvas, which is all to say, you too can do this. So the first marks that he makes on the canvas are the handprints. And you see these handprints up in the corners here. Black ones over here, red ones over here. And then following on to that, there are also these kind of black smears where the paint, it seems to my eye, has he's removed a lot of the paint, but there's still a little bit of residual paint on his hand. And he's just lightly brushing and smearing across the canvas, just catching the top of the nubs of the canvas and making these sort of basic outlines here. Light gray, you know, as more and more paint is removed from his hands by the canvas, it becomes light gray to the point where eventually it just disappears. He's doing a similar thing over here with his red. It starts to fade out, and he starts to just bring very light passages of red underneath there. But this mostly gets covered when he then moves from this very sort of tactile approach to painting to the more abstracted or removed kind of painting, where he's coming then back with sort of two principal ways of applying the paint. One is just dripping the paint. Again, either dipping a stick into a can of enamel paint. Usually his paint was a house paint. These enamel paints were house paints. They came in a very limited palette, which sometimes explains why he chose the colors he did. He didn't really have a lot of choice with these house paints. But, and those are these long sort of fluid ones, the very glossy ones, because again, they are an enamel paint. So they will become glossy. That is the very definition of an enamel paint, is that it is glossy and sturdy and hard when it dries. But then there are these other lines that you see here. These sort of more tubular lines and long ones like this here. And they just weave their way around the canvas, one after another after another. These are most likely achieved by him taking a tube of artist oil paint and squeezing that tube. Now, how he actually squeezed that tube is open to discussion. And one way is that he might just open the cap of the tube and squeeze along and do it that way. Another, and I think more likely way, is that he pokes a little pinhole or takes a nail or something and sticks the, opens up a hole in the side of the tube, and then squeezes that. And that is how, the reason why I think that's more likely is that some of these lines are awfully thin and narrow and really, you know, almost like a spider's web, if you will. And so that would be achieved through a much narrower kind of puncture in the tube. So that is how he arrives at this through a series of sometimes painting with the enamel paint, with the stick, or maybe just dripping directly from the enamel can, and then other times squeezing these long, narrow skeins of artist oil paint. And it's just a sort of constant dialogue between those techniques. But he began with laying out the composition very much directly in contact with the canvas.
Can I ask you? So oil paint can take a long time to dry. What is the lapse between these various phases?
Oh, you know, the enamel paint dries relatively quickly, and he can come back later that day, and sometimes he's painting directly into wet enamel paint. So when you see a kind of marbled quality to the paint, that's most likely achieved by him putting a wet paint onto a still wet paint. And those things sort of, you know, combining together to make that marbled quality to it. So that's a long introduction to, okay, well, why did we restore this? And there were a number of things that we needed to do to restore this painting. One is, remember he started with the raw canvas. It's an unprimed, unsized canvas. Over time, it's canvas, it's made out of cellulose, it's like paper, exposure to light, just exposure to the natural run of things. It will begin to discolor over time, and that is indeed what happened to the areas of canvas that were exposed. So our first step in this restoration of this was to remove some of the discolored materials that had accumulated over time. Some of that was dirt and grime, some of it was kind of inherent degradation of the canvas itself. And the way we did that was we simply took a dampened swab with pH-adjusted water, roll it over a small area, maybe about this size or so, come back with a blotter, a piece of very absorbent blotter paper, and then just lightly press that onto the surface. And the blotter paper will begin to whip those materials that the water has begun to solubilize out. And this is just an iterative process where you go back and do a little more and a little more. And the idea behind doing that was to make this look rather more even, and it was a little uneven, a little patchy in the amount of discoloration that occurred over time. So the idea was not to make this look pristine white. We couldn't do that, and it really wouldn't quite feel right if this were pristine white. But to make it look more even overall, so you don't think, my gosh, what is wrong with that canvas? But rather you think more about, what is this painting that Pollock made about?
How much whiter than it is now? I mean, it's beige.
Yeah, well, a standard artist canvas is somewhat beige.
Right.
It's not going to be pristine and white, and I doubt that it's ever was.
Did you ever have to deal with sagging on either of the canvases, especially like that one?
Deal with
Sagging.
sagging. No. No, but I was just thinking, because that was a problem with the mural painting that is at the University of Iowa and was restored at the Getty a few years ago. But no, these did not suffer that problem of sagging at the top as is happening in that painting. One of the other things that we had to do in the restoration here was also clean the dirt and grime off the surface of the paint itself. So again, and that's done much the same way as we were doing with the removing the discolored materials from the canvas. Just taking a cotton swab with, in this case, pH-adjusted water with one or two other things added to it that would help sort of bind that dirt into the swab and pull it away. And we just worked our way across the surface of the canvas, cleaning those areas. Now, one of the things that had happened over time was that the tube squeezes that I was talking to you about that come out of the artist oil paint tube, they landed on the canvas, and were very tenuously held, and they were really thin in some areas. And some of those had actually broken off. And so you would find a line, and then there would be a skip in the line, and then there would be another part of the line, and then there would be another skip in the line. Some of those skips might be about this long, others might be about this long, but they were really self-evident because you would have, this, the obvious continuation of the line and then a void in it. And so what we had to do with that was find, just cast material that would mimic the thickness of that line and the roundness of that line, and then shape it so that it would conform to the void in the line. So it might have to be a little rounded so that one end matches the other end. Place that down right at the appropriate spot in the skein of paint, and then retouch it with our retouching material. So if it was a white line, we would retouch it with white, black, and so on. And just to let you know, back to what a conservator does, one of the principles of what we do in conservation is what we call the principle of reversibility. Anything that we add to a work should be reversible without affecting the original. So those materials that I was just talking to you about, the added line and the retouch on top of it, the coloring of that added line on top, are all reversible. They are done in materials that we can easily take off without affecting anything in the original. They will literally just pop off if somebody else in the future, another conservator in the future, needs to redo it, or they just, for some reason, the rationale of restoration changes, and all you want to see is the original material that Jackson Pollock touched, and nothing that Jim Coddington touched. So there is one last thing that I want to, and I'm going on a bit long here, but this is really, I think, a very important point, and one that you all might not think about, and if you did, you know, bravo to you. Jackson Pollock once was asked about, what is it that you are trying to achieve with your paintings? And he said, I paint between the easel and the mural. And the easel being the kind of standard painting where it's painted on an easel and it hangs on a wall in a frame and so on, and kind of occupies its own distinct environment. The mural versus the mural being the work of art that's literally part of the building. It is part of the architecture. And he was working somewhere between those two sort of vast histories of painting. And when we were working on this painting, we had to take it off the stretcher that it was stretched on. And we could see that there was a very thin line of tack holes in the tacking margin where it had once been attached to a different size stretcher, a stretcher that was actually substantially thinner than the stretcher that had been on for the previous 20 years or so. So we had a new stretcher built, and we also did some research into what kinds of stretchers would have been available to Pollock around 1948. And they were all tending to be much thinner stretchers. That was the standard issue stretcher. So we mimicked we made a new stretcher that would support the painting, but it was much narrower. And then we also devised a hanging device so that it would hang as flush to the wall as possible, so that the plane of the painting becomes much closer to the wall and becomes something, I believe, closer to between the easel and the mural. And so, it's a very subtle thing, and we don't often think about how a work is presented as being part of the restoration of that work, but indeed that can be a really fundamental part of a restoration. And all of these things are things that we do in dialogue with our curators here, thinking about how to solve that problem, what the appropriate solution would be from a curatorial standpoint, not just from a preservation and conservation standpoint.
Could you show us where a little strip where you replace?
I couldn't possibly find it. They're completely, I probably could, but it's going to take me a while because they really are, matched as closely as possible, so that that's not a thought that occurs to somebody. Oh, there's restoration there, and then it becomes kind of a diversion from looking at Pollock.
Then do you keep records where you touched?
Sorry?
Do you keep records?
Oh, yes. The question is, do we keep records of where we touch? And absolutely, documentation of everything that we do is undertaken in forms of written narrative documentation, what are the materials we use, where did we use them, and photographic documentation of all those steps.
Okay. How do things change when he does this 2 years later?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I think that in certainly the kind of terms that I think that I sometimes think about paintings, which is, all right, what are the materials in the painting? How are they being manipulated? How are they being used? I refer to this as being maybe a little bit transitional, because he's at one point in the creation of the canvas in contact with it. At other points, he's above the canvas, dripping and pouring and squeezing the paint. Here, it's entirely separate from the canvas. Every mark on this canvas has been made with him dripping and pouring from the cans of paint, or dipping some sort of a tool into the enamel paint, and just making these long, loopy, lacy lines. The thickness of the lines, which is really essential to the way he develops his composition, is, I think, achieved a couple of different ways. One way is simply by making a very strong thrust with the whatever tool he's using, and that will make a much thicker, wider line. But you'll also see that on some of these lines, they're long, narrow, thin, seemingly endless loops of paint, and just sort of thin stains. I think that the way he probably did that was that he took a smallish can of paint, one that he could hold in his hand, and just simply held it above the canvas and slowly poured. So he essentially has an endless reservoir of paint to work his way around the canvas. And he wants to make that line a little bit thicker. He'll come down closer to the canvas, and of course that will deposit a little more canvas, or he'll hold his hand a little longer in place. And that way he can get some variety along the length of this line.
does it do that for the part that is in the middle? It's
Well,
not static, right?
I don't see any footsteps on this, so it's laid flat on his in his studio. The size of this is largely determined by the simple fact that it pretty much takes up the entire studio, or most of the usable space in the studio. No, he's reaching in, and he might be stepping on it, but he's not left any evidence of stepping on it. And it, you know, I think that there would have been some evidence, either a footprint, you know, via dirt, or even the mark of a footprint in some slightly wet paint. How do you know which is the top and the bottom? Because Jackson Pollock first installed this at Betty Parsons. He installed it a particular way. There are photographs of it, and that's the way we've done it. Yeah.
Question here.
Yeah. Yes.
With a painting this complex, how do you, as a conservator, decide, now it's time to work on it? Like, how can you tell when it's degraded?
Thank you. So for those who maybe didn't hear the question, all right, well, how do we know that it was time to restore this painting? It began with that 1998 exhibition. Again, that fundamental point of being able to look at this and compare this to similar works done in the really in the same months that this was painted in 1950. This is 1/31/1950 is the title of this work. And we saw some anomalies in the painting at that time. We didn't know what to make of them then. But we filed that back and thought, we need to investigate this at some point in the future. There was nothing about this painting that suggested there was an urgent need to restore it. No paint was flaking off. The canvas was in solid shape. So we could take our time thinking about what we would, you know, if and when we decided to do a restoration on this, you know, we could take our time doing our research to arrive at, I think, you know, what to do and when to do it. And just as with 1/8/1948, there was some discoloration on this canvas, but it's much less disfigured because there's less area of raw canvas here. He's really covered the canvas with his various campaigns of painting. But still, there are some exposed areas, and they had somewhat discolored, but not as dramatically as over in 1A. I can't tell you why, but there just was that difference. Maybe just a difference in the raw materials of the canvas itself. There was also dirt and grime on the surface, muting it slightly, and comparing it to some of the other works, which seemed to be brighter as well. We thought that muting probably was just a result of this having never been cleaned since it came into the collection when in 1968, I think. But the main problem that, and the one that really required a lot of research and really deep thinking, was that there were some very unusual areas of paint peppered throughout the surface. And they were very fussy little marks, you know, like they'd been put on with a little brush. They also had uncharacteristic texture to polish. They were slightly textured on the surface. And again, these are enamel paints. Enamel paints are engineered by the companies to be very flat and smooth. That's how they get their gloss. So when Pollock applies them, they do exactly what enamel paint is supposed to do. They land on the surface, they flow, and they get a nice, flat, smooth surface with them. These anomalous areas that we began to find as we looked closely at this in '98 and in subsequent years were anything but that. They were dry, fussy, and seemingly applied very, very locally and very, very directly, not from above. So our thought was these may well be restoration, but if they are restoration, you know, why and when? And those are the questions that we, and what? Why, when, and what? Those were the questions that we began to try to track down, especially in the year or so leading up to the restoration when we did undertake it. So the when was something that we went to the archives to try to find out, and there was no clear record of it. There was no record of a restoration once it came into MoMA's collection in '68, and there was some correspondence between restorers and the previous owner, but no record of a restoration at any time during that. beyond it. So then we went on to the why of it, and that was a little easier to find because here we did use some technical imaging. We took some X-rays. We could see that there were cracks underneath these areas of paint, but it seemed like there was plenty of original Jackson Pollock. It wasn't like there was a big chunk of Pollock's paint missing. There were just cracks there that it looked to us like whoever put this on, and we weren't withholding the possibility that Pollock himself had done that. That was always a possibility in our research, that they were done to cover up these cracks, which, you know, in a young painting were somewhat disfiguring possibly. So the when and the why, you know, we don't know when, we kind of think we know why. The what became a question for scientific analysis. This is where the science becomes absolutely vital. So our scientists in the conservation department took some small samples, and by small I mean microscopic, smaller than the head of the pen. Analyzed these samples and found that the material that was suspicious, that was anomalous, was very, very different from the enamel paint. And not only that, it was a material that would not have been available to Jackson Pollock as a painter in the 1950s. It was a known material at that time, but it was not an artist material. Whereas in the 1950s and 60s, it was a fairly well-known restoration material. So this again pointed us towards this as being put on by a restorer. You know, that's a lot of strong evidence, but what really clinched the deal for us, and this is my favorite part of the story, is that an art history professor of mine from undergraduate school had said, you know, I have these pictures from 1962 that I took of the Pollocks in your collection and other collections. If you ever need them, just give me a call. I did, and some of those photographs were detailed photographs of areas that were of interest to us that had these anomalous passages of paint, and in 1962, they were not there. These photographs show that they were not there. Jackson Pollock died in 1956, so we know they couldn't have been applied by Pollock, so they were applied by some unidentified restorer, and we felt very comfortable then in taking them off, which we then proceeded to do over a period of about 8 months. Yeah.
I had a question, but here in the, especially here in the center, there are some of the drippings that fold vertically.
Yeah.
So what's the? So he was painting with the canvas flat on the floor, but did it then?
Yeah. Great question. And also, and many of these questions, I would, if you have other questions that you think about what we're saying here today, go to the museum's website. We blogged about the restoration of these the 3 Pollock paintings that we restored. It's a series of about 10 different blog posts with lots of photo documentation. I think that you'll find those interesting because this question we actually did address there, and it's a really interesting one for exactly the reasons that you say. There are a series of brown drips. They are shortish. They're about this big, about that narrow. You can come up and look closely at them when we're done. And they sort of fall in a pattern right down along here. They are clearly applied when the painting is upright because the thickness of the drip comes down and then dries exactly how, you know, if you were to, you know, throw a little bit of paint at the wall, it might drip down and do that, and you did it again, it would do the exact same thing. So it's, you know, this is very interesting. It is obvious that Pollock would take a painting, you know, from the floor after he had painted a certain amount on it, would somehow get it up on the wall of the studio, look at it. Sometimes it came back down and an additional campaign of pouring might take place. But clearly in this case, he was looking at it with it upright, posted somehow onto the wall of the studio, and you can see this in the background of some of the photographs of the studio. And what he decided to do was make a few final edits. Now, what I find most interesting about it is that I try to imagine in my mind's eye what this painting looks like without those last little brown drips on it. I can't see any difference in my mind. But it was really meaningful to Jackson Pollock to make those last marks. And that's what's so interesting about just taking the time to look closely at a painting and understand as best you can what the meaning of every mark is, because it means something to the artist. They are trying to achieve something with each of those marks, and the more that you can understand what they've achieved, I think the deeper you see into that painting.
Which is the third painting now which was shown?
It's a painting from 1951, Echo. It's on loan to Dallas for a exhibition of those late paintings, the Black Core paintings, as they're called. Yet another, as I mentioned at the very beginning, of our responsibility, making sure that paintings can get to venues like that and be part of very important exhibitions like that Black Core painting. So it's in Dallas. It will be coming back here in the next few months. I'm not certain when. Yes?
I'm curious, because you're just talking about loaning
Yeah.
a painting. So it's freezing cold here. It's very warm in Dallas.
Yeah.
How do you deal? Are they temperature control, shift in a temperature control?
You bet.
vehicle?
Yep. They're put in well-sealed crates that have thermal insulation and shock and vibration insulation built into them. They are shipped in trucks that are climate controlled. They go into airplanes if they have to fly somewhere in a climate controlled. They're hardly ever, if ever, outside of pretty narrow range of temperature control, and to best as we can, humidity control as well. Put a logger inside one of these things and it stays pretty rock steady throughout the trip. Yes?
I noticed in one of the other paintings that it was signed in the lower left, and I'm wondering whether Pollock was left-handed or right-handed, and I'm also wondering where the signature is on this painting. I can't find it.
Yeah. So the question is about his signatures, and what, from that can we define whether he's left-handed or right-handed? I don't know whether we can do it from the signatures, but clearly in the photographs he's using his right hand mostly. So that's the best evidence I have for whether he's a lefty or a righty. There is no signature on the front of this. He did put one on the back, which is, of course, documented in the museum files. Yes?
That reminds me, there are films of him doing some of the drip
Yeah.
paintings. Are those used by the conservator?
Sure. That is one source of thinking about, well, how is a particular mark on a painting made? He is, doing his technique in those films. I can think of two particular films, one where he's painting on a canvas outside, another where he's painting on a piece of glass where the camera is positioned underneath the glass so you can actually see the paint falling onto the surface of the glass. Another way that we figure this kind of stuff out is actually do it ourselves. Try to recreate, not recreate a Pollock, but recreate the kind of marks so we can understand how they interact with one another, how one that is applied one way might look this way, one that is applied another way might look that way, so that we can sort of decode the mark making just by doing it oneself. You got it.
Last
Sorry.
question.
Yeah.
Do you work alone or do you have a team?
Oh boy, we have a team here. We have a great team here. There are 20 people in conservation. We have paintings conservators, we have paper conservators, we have photograph conservators, sculpture conservators who work on basically anything 3D. We also have media conservators working on technology-based art. And we also have, as I mentioned, scientists who help us with our analysis and also developing new tools and materials for us to use. So that all adds up to a team of 20. That, at various times, also includes students who are studying conservation, who are working on their graduate degrees in conservation and come to finish their work with us. Yeah?
When you look at Picasso collages that have newspaper script in it, they've turned brown, and,
Yeah.
and we all learned them as brown, but they were black and white when they were done originally.
Yeah.
Is there some argument made for works like Pollock's that will allow them to discolor and change over time rather than...
Yeah, I mean, because you can't stop it, so you might as well live with it. But the rates of change on these things is quite varied. The specification used is a great one because those newspapers, as we all know, newspaper discolors really, really rapidly. And it may well be that by the time Picasso or Braque put those onto the surface of their collage, they were somewhat discolored already. They weren't pristine white. I don't know that, but it's a plausible idea to consider. Similarly, we can't take these canvases back to white. We can't take the sort of inherent discoloration within the medium itself that might be making it slightly darker, yellower, and therefore muted. There's nothing one can do about that. But those things that we can do something about, like getting the dirt and grime off, removing whatever materials we can from that will readily come off of the canvas that have discolored, that all gets it back closer to that moment when it was still in the studio. But it's a chimera to think that we can get all the way back there.
When you paint a wall in a house, and then you need to repair one wall, you need to go corner to corner so that you don't see this change in color. So if he's using those kinds of commercial house, there has to be natural change in color.
Yes, there is natural change in color, but it's it's every one of these things has changed pretty evenly overall. They weren't applied at wildly different times, but they were applied out of pretty much the same cans of paint. So that aging is going to be very consistent overall, and that differential aging problem that you cite really it doesn't come into play here.
So we know that Pollock painted with the unstretched canvas, and you were talking about the stretcher there. How much canvas is there behind? And is this the original stretcher? I noticed that there are some holes here.
This is not the original stretcher. There's, I don't know, about maybe 8 inches of canvas around the edges, excess top and bottom. And this is probably a somewhat thicker stretcher than he originally had. And so this is maybe a potential future restoration. To do for this what we did for that. The reason why we didn't do it in this case is that there is a second canvas affixed to this to give it additional support. Again, there's no documentation of when that happened, but it's clearly right there. It makes it heavier, stiffer, and much harder to work with around a thinner stretcher. And we're not quite as certain of the evidence that this was on quite as thin a stretcher as that. But that said, still, we reconfigured the hanging of this on this stretcher so that we could get the plane of this canvas at least a little closer and flusher to the wall. But it might be that at some point in the future we do decide to put this on, or somebody decides to put this on a narrower stretcher.
So if there's a second canvas, then the signature's coming.
That's right. So, the question was, so if there's a second canvas, the signature is covered, and that is true. But there were we have whoever put that second canvas on, traced it and put it back on. So, but how do we know that in fact they're not just making that up? This is again where some technical imaging comes into play. Using an infrared camera, we can actually see the original signature pretty much exactly as transcribed, but just slightly shifted from where it's transcribed.
We've talked about the dripping mostly. I would like to ask if Pollock was as experimental with other techniques. You mentioned his prints, but also the areographer.
Yeah. His prints are, I think, this exhibition has been especially interesting to me because I focused much more on his prints than I did in '98, where I had dozens and dozens of paintings, and that just consumed my time, and it was just so fascinating. In this case, I would draw your attention to 2 of the efforts at printmaking, and they were very successful efforts in my mind. First of all, the silkscreen prints in the first room. And you can see Pollock experimenting with 2 things that he then makes use of in his paintings. One is the use of a colored background. Pollock was trained by the painter Thomas Hart Benton, who was very conversant with classical painting techniques. And one of the classical painting techniques is to actually use a colored ground, red, blue, green, not just the white ground that you normally associate with painting, but these other colored grounds. And in the silkscreen prints, he's using blue paper, sometimes black paper, sometimes white, sometimes orange. And I think, testing to see what the effect is of his design on these colored backgrounds and what the different kinds of almost optical effects of the colors that he's using can be on these different colored backgrounds. The other thing that he does in his silkscreen prints that I think he then that then migrates into his paintings is, you know, you can come back with a silkscreen print and print back on top of it. You know, you make some changes in the design on the silkscreen, and then squeegee another color through that changed area of design. You see one particular print there where it's mostly printed in black, but then there's this bright orange that has been printed on top of the initial black application. That kind of thinking in planes of color is something that if you go, then just turn the corner there in that first room, or just turn around and look at the She-Wolf, one of his earliest paintings in our collection. You'll see that he put this gray kind of paint onto it in big, broad brushstrokes, and he's just actually applying, you know, locally, but thinking very much the way he was with the silkscreens, I think, applying a flat plane of gray in various areas. And so I think that, you know, as I say, some of the work that he's doing in other media, even in these tiny little silkscreen prints, he's thinking about how it also applies to painting, or testing out on silkscreens what he maybe had already done in paintings, just to see if it would work in that medium too.
At the very beginning of the exhibition, there's a paper with ink that's probably been blown onto it, and which I find under remarkable control and extremely beautiful composition. I'm wondering if he worked that way frequently.
Did he? Okay, so the question is about some prints in the first room. There are two prints, very, very similar, in fact, identical lithographs, landscape with steer. One is the straight lithograph and printed in black on paper. Then the other one that you're referring to with color applied to it is the same print, but Pollock has taken either an airbrush or some sort of an atomizer and blown color onto the print itself. And this is a technique that he probably learned in Siqueiros' experimental workshop, something that Pollock was sort of not deeply involved with, but was well aware of and working around the edges in New York. And Siqueiros was, you know, a fabulous experimentalist with materials and techniques. And this is something that this is probably where Pollock first learned about the use of enamel paints. Siqueiros was often called Il Duco, because Duco was the most common enamel paint. Thank you for that. But the so he is working with this spray paint, and I think it's just reflective of his ability to look and seize upon something from some other area of his life, and it might reemerge 2, 3, 4 years later, even longer, as he thinks about it, but it's always in his arsenal of potential tools to use when he's making a work of art.
Actually, the piece I was referring to is just as you enter the exhibit, immediately on your right.
Oh, to the right, yeah.
And it's just ink that's been blown on.
Yeah, which is done some years later. Some of that is probably blown on, some is also possibly dripped on. But thank you for calling everybody's attention to that one as well. Just to sort of underline the point that here's something that he does in the 30s and comes back to in the 40s and 50s.
One thing that I noticed that maybe it's not meaningful, I would like to know if you have a theory, but there is a little pink.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea where it
comes
from?
Of course I do. It's what we call studio accident. And, you know, but, you know, and that's what it is. So this is hanging in his studio in the Springs. It's up on the wall. He's painted another painting that has pink in it. And that almost surely is the painting that now is in the Whitney's collection. which we know was painted very much around the same time. And this is just a little back splatter. Maybe he's just taking a little pink and beginning to splatter it, or it's coming down. And a couple of these little pink dots wind up here. Again, they didn't bother Jackson Pollock, so they don't bother me.
One more question?
Is that just a hypothesis? Because you talked about the short brown lines and nobody knows why they're there. So maybe you were working on thinking, well, we'll think this one too.
Sure. But no, it's a good question because it forces me to differentiate between the two, and why do I feel confident in one being studio accident and the other being intentional by Pollock? And the reason why I feel like the brown dot drips are intentional is that there's a pattern to them. They tend to follow a long black area. They fall, and there's a regularity to them. And whereas the two or three pink dots, they're down there. They don't seem to have a reason for being in the composition, and that's why if you can see a reason for being in the composition, somehow holding it down in some way, then they could well be intentional. In the end, it's all intentional because he saw them, he okayed them.
I'm very curious about not just your background, but what does it take today to have your job? Are you an artist? Are you an art historian? A mixture of everything?
Thick skin. We come into conservation from a variety of avenues. But one thing that is common to all of us is, you don't kind of wake up in the 5th grade and say, I'm going to be a conservator. It's something you come to kind of late after you've tested out some other things, or it's in the back of your mind. So, for instance, I was an undergraduate biology major. By the time I left, I was much more interested in art history. Other people in our departments come in through art history. Some come in through science. Those are the sort of three pillars of our discipline. And so you will find people coming from one of those. We don't have too many MBAs. But we do have some.
But at some point, are you taking studio art courses?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And so the next step, once you decide you want to be a conservator, you need to go to graduate school. That's what it's become now. It's a professionalized field in that way. And you need to have a portfolio of studio artwork and also conservation work in order to actually qualify to get into these schools, as well as all of that other academic work that I just have. Do they? The question is, how do the fakes get by? They seem to have a great deal of trouble getting by these days. Well, I guess some people are more willing to believe in some things than other people are. But it's always going to be a question in the art field, because what is the authentic work of art is sort of the fundamental question of art history.
Exhibition, if some works at the on, some haven't, is there an uneven quality that you compare it to a viewer?
The question is, when you go to an exhibition and let's say some works have been restored and others have not, is that difference apparent? And I would say yes, very much so. It's going to be probably much more dramatically evident in an old master exhibition where the discolored varnishes and so on can linger there for decades and centuries. And when one takes one off, maybe, say in a Rembrandt exhibition, that Rembrandt looks pretty clean and the other looks very muted and possibly distorted. Less so in a modern exhibition. You go to a World Hall exhibition, or even in our 98 Pollock retrospective. The differences were much more subtle, but they still exist. It just takes a little more time to unearth. And so I'm not sure that it would have a huge impact on, and it doesn't have a huge impact on me when I go to see these exhibitions, but I'm aware of it.
When you said you didn't know how some of the lines were made, was that because no one asked him, or did he refuse to answer questions about how he made some of them?
No, when I said I don't know how some lines are mid, it's just that my imagination hasn't caught up to the possibilities yet. I'm just trying to reconstruct how it might happen. Pollock offered very little information about how he, at least articulated very little. He offered a great deal of information about how he painted by allowing Hans Namath and other photographers into his studio. Those became, those are in some ways, very important art historically too, because it opened up the artist studio in ways that people hadn't ever thought about before. And documentation of works in artist studio has become, in the intervening years, rather more common. Yeah.
In the beginning of the lecture, you said that when you examine or analyze the work of a certain part, you try to imagine what goal the painter would like to achieve. So, you could get this, that, for example, for white part, what do you think Jackson tried or intended to achieve? What goal?
What goal was he trying to achieve?
Well,
why did he put it this way?
Oh, why did he put it this way rather than that way? The question is, what do I think, if I'm understanding it correctly, what was Jackson Pollock trying to achieve? And maybe this is a great way to end this, because this is a really kind of poignant thing to me. Pollock was a very, very ambitious artist. He came to Los Angeles, from Los Angeles, New York, to be an artist. And it took him a long time to achieve anything close to success and or respectability. But he was ambitious in that he wanted to really push what it means to make a painting. So this is what I'm getting at, what was he trying to achieve? And he once, Lee Krasner once said, that, and she was one of the few people that was allowed into his studio, or at least artists that actually saw him paint. And he was working on a painting once and stepped back and was thinking about it and turned to her and said, "Is this a painting?" And I think the casual response is, "Oh yeah, that mess of stuff you put on, how could that be a painting?" But Krasner knew what his ambitions were, and that was, and they were embodied in that question, and that is, have I changed the definition of what a painting is? That's, I think, what he was about. Because this whole effort to make an abstract work of art is actually an incredibly complicated thing, and even more complicated to do as successfully as he did there. So, is this a painting, is the question he asked? And the answer is, of course, yes it is.
Thank you very much. Thank you. For those of you who are interested in more special guests